Has a very relevant career related to AI, I'd say. Professor Wade is Chair of Computer Science in Trinity College and has a personal chair in Artificial Intelligence. He is also the co-founder and former director of the ADAP Center, which is a world-leading research center for AI-driven digital content technologies, and also the co-director of the Center for Postgraduate Research Training in Digitally Enhanced Reality, and has been awarded by Fellowship of Trinity College, researches focuses on AI, personalization, generative AI-based system, and has published so far over 350 scientific papers on the topic. And today, Professor Wade is going to talk about opportunities, challenges, and adoption strategy of generative AI technology in education. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be more involved in the Coimbra group going forward. So my background is AI, so in some respects that always means when I talk to academics in my own university they kind of ignore me because I already know technology, therefore if I talk about education technology it's too easy for me or something. But in the other thing that I just recently took up the responsibility for is about 2-3 months ago I was asked to take over the Dean of Undergraduate Studies and the Deanship that looks after all teaching and learning for the university. So I'm now in the unended position of having been an AI acolyte driver enthusiast to now have been put in charge of trying to introduce AI in the university. So it's funny how problems look different from the two perspectives, okay? So I'll try and address both along the way as we move forward. And if anyone has any questions along the way, please feel free. It's just trying to make sure that I covered what we wanted. So I'm going to talk a little bit about generative AI and talk about its current state of adoption. 2 points really here. One is why, what's different about it. I mean, Pinar gave a really good explanation of existing, more what I would consider traditional AI in terms of machine learning and so forth. Gen AI uses those same models, but there's very different reasons why it's been taken up. And I just want to try and cover those because people then understand it's not just all the same thing again. The second thing is, I know we're looking at how it's being adopted in industry. The second thing I want to look at then is its increasing role in education. So we saw some examples of Gen AI being used particularly to support artificial, augmented reality and virtual reality. But I want to talk a little bit broader in terms of how it's being used and where it comes into the university. The risks and challenges, again, Simon introduced the AI Act. I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of what it actually means for teaching and learning and when we have to get aware of it. If you're a European, if you're in the UK or if you're the US, you're less worried until someone tries to unify. And then finally, the adoption strategies. How are universities going about adopting Gen AI within their universities, within their teaching and learning programs and so forth? Different universities, it's a journey we're all on. Some of us will be starting, some of us are a little bit further. Very few, and I'd say actually none, are complete yet. So what it is, so as Pinar said, AI is everything to do with making machines do what a human would normally have to. We would class as intelligent by a human. Machine learning being to have the machine not be told what to do, but actually learn from experience. Deep learning representing the neural models that I mentioned earlier, which was using models to actually train, but the only thing is they need huge amounts of data. And then finally, generative AI, which basically most of us are using based on pre-trained foundation models, massive models that cost a fortune to, around about 100 million to 200 million, depending who you talk to originally train, and then how you use them going forward. They have the ability to generate any content: text, image, speech, video, conversation. That's the other part that's important about this. It's conversational. It's not just generating content. It's composed to your own requirements, and it is convincing and eloquent. And that's the other part that some people don't always realize. Even when it's talking twaddle, even when it's talking rubbish, It's really convincing rubbish because it's very, very good at forming language. Okay? So in terms of education, what are the applications? Anything from question and answers, administrative information, marketing information, customer supply, customer interactions are now driven by AI. I can shout. Are driven by AI. Process and knowledge exchange, project management, training, and so forth. All are being hugely dependent on large language models and how we're using them. So what's different? The difference really between pre-2021 and post-2021 is the fact that it's operating on all of those forms of media at the same time without any real difficulty. Second is there's massive or low friction. In other words, what that means is if you can make a question, you can use Gen AI. So there is no training of using an AI app, there is no training in terms of understanding how the model is put together or anything like that. If you can ask a question, you can use it. And it's been used in multiple applications around all at the same time. So remember, before what was happening was in the more traditional machine learning neural networks approach, what we used to have to do is do massive amount of curation of data, make sure it's correct, all the rest, and then do the training and so forth, and back and forward. In Gen AI, a lot of times you're using a pre-trained model. So the actual, I just lost them. Okay. It will use a pre-trained model, which means it's being used in the HR department, in the marketing department, in the communications department, in the product development departments. It's been used in all the organizations at one time. That's a massive hit for an organization. That's why it's suddenly really big. The second reason why it's the fastest adopted technology in the world. So if we think about things that we think of were fast, maybe like Spotify, it took 11 years to reach 100 million users. If we think about Facebook, that was 4.5 years. If we think of something that's viral, like Instagram, or even more viral, TikTok, 9 months to reach 100 million users. Gen AI took 2 months. That's orders of magnitude faster. So the take-up has been huge. It's the fastest growing technology in the world, and it's also one of the fastest developing technology in the world. The other big difference is a lot of the time, AI had been focused on automating things in the factory, in the office, or whatever. Gen AI is focused on the knowledge worker. So it straight away is at a different layer in the organization in terms of what jobs it's affecting, what roles it's affecting, and how it's changing behavior. That is different. It's at the paralegal level, not the shunting documents around level. It's at the understanding and pulling out facts and policies and so forth in legal documents or in medical documents or whatever, not just in the query. It's rewriting them in places. And then the last part, I don't know about you, but okay, I do talk to my dog occasionally, don't think he really understands me, kind of gives me a nice yap every now and then. I do talk to my car when it doesn't start, but I don't expect to have a conversation with it. Gen AI is the only thing that you're going to have a conversation with that's not human, and will react as if you knew it. That has a ping on your brain. That has an effect on your brain, okay? Because it's a totally different relationship. Your brain is so used to the only thing that ever you talk to is a human. We'll talk a little bit about what that effects can be later. So that's just a look at and from the back, there's no way you're going to read it, but that's fine. That's just a look at the all different forms of language models back from 2016. Language models have been around for ages. We had small ones back in 2000, right? But they were just producing gibberish or really poor English or poor whatever language you're trying to generate. It really wasn't until ChatGPT 3.0 that most of the research community stood up and went, okay, that's different. That's actually closer to what you'd expect a human to produce. 3.5 was by far the step change. And that's when everyone remembers and everyone talks about 2022. And then now we're at 4.0 or 0 point something, if you believe the literature at the moment, and so forth. So it's just huge numbers. The other thing is that the barrier of entry is now becoming really high. It's now taking between 100 and 200 million euros to train one of these models because they are so large. Okay? That's problematic for the rest of us, but for a number of companies that are in this business, this is a great barrier to entry. And that's why there are so few really big providers of really big models, because of the barrier to entry. What has it been used for? Before we step into teaching and learning, let's see what the industry is actually using it for. The five was a really interesting research by McKinsey, 2023, looked at what are the top areas that are actually using Gen AI. And this is 23, so it's already a year old. And by the way, a year in Gen AI time is like 5 years in any other technology, okay? But it was in sales and marketing. Now, we'd expect that because they are the most hungry content-using departments in any organization. But then you look at software engineering and you go, hang on a second. Software engineering, that's an algorithm. We heard about them. That takes a lot of intelligence to compose right. It's generating the program language, the programs. So what that means, a typical software engineering team of 8 is now being reduced to 4 or 6. And Gen AI is sitting in as its next. And it's generating the code. And it's correcting the other guy's code. Okay? So it's changing the way we actually develop software. Customer operations, because I don't know if you ever used any of those websites that have little someone popping up saying, "Hi, I'm Nigel. How can I help you?" And you get really irritated. And usually after about 3 or 4 questions, it disappears as, "I've got to get someone to help you." Right? Doesn't do that anymore. Not with Gen AI. It is much better at understanding your questions and much better at actually providing you with solutions. But the one that's in there that everyone should be really surprised about is product R&D. Okay? Hang on a second. That's the creative part of my organization. That's the part that's supposed to really know what I'm trying to do and generate the next line of products. Actually, Gen AI is actually it's the 5th highest usage of Gen AI. I'll talk a little bit about where, but say, for example, in chemical companies, Gen AI is generating possible approaches to developing new compounds and new affordances. And then the ones that it suggests are the ones that actually the PhD in the lab tests out. So all of a sudden you can do a massive scale search across compounds to really look at the next. Drug companies, there's a drug company which is exclusively using Gen AI to do its first pass in terms of what it wants to evaluate. So all of a sudden these are very knowledge-driven, very high intelligence aspects of an organization being superpowered, if you like, by Gen AI, or so it would look like. The ones coming up, manufacturing, finance, risk and compliance, really? Yes. So I know one of my graduates was working in one of the larger healthcare companies in the policies and customer relations, and has now moved into another job. But Gen AI was completely changing how they were dealing with those health policies and the different options and so forth. What about education? Well, they estimated that would have an impact. First and foremost, and this is now, to be honest with you, I think they focus more on the ed tech side of things, around higher education here. So, and we know that they're slightly different in terms of budgets and the way they organise. But they saw it was really being used in software engineering. If there was any development of software, it was being used in supply chain management and marketing and sales. Very little about teaching and learning, funnily enough. And Simon introduced the Gardner hype cycle, and yes, it is on a slope. That's because people have heard of Gen AI now. So usually it's hype, and they're now kind of, I've heard of that before. I'm not surprised to hear it. How long will be the trough of disillusionment? Well, we do think Gen AI is different in the sense that it'll be quicker coming out of that. The danger with it is there's so much hype. The danger with the expectations being beyond what the technology can do. And we all know that AI has a terrible habit of overselling itself. I've been through 2 winters at least. But this is different. So, what are those organizations that are using it? What are they finding? Because they're the first movers. So let's see what are the casualties, what will we learn? Well, the very first thing was seen as productivity improvement. Okay, depending on who you talk to, it's anywhere from 10% to 40%, 50%. Averaging out somewhere around 30%. Okay, 30% improvement is really, really and impressive. That's an extra day in the week. Okay. It's enabling much more rapid exchange of knowledge. I have not been to a conference where one or two of the people have said, so my opening remarks were generated by ChatGPT, or this was generated, and there's only one slide in this that is slightly generated by ChatGPT, just to point that out, and when it comes I will tell you, but the rest of this was mine. But the point being is that it actually can really improve things. It makes much more faster decision making, because you get to get the right information at the right time. You've got to know that it's the right information, you need to fact check, but you can get it. Making content production much faster and less expensive, and also lowering the cost of interacting with customers or within your enterprise. And it makes a much more enriched engagement. You don't get those banal answers. So in enterprises, it is being adopted for these purposes, but productivity is the one that's usually driving it. What about in education? Well, from a student perspective, I've got 3 areas: students, from a tutors, and from admin. Because as universities, we need to think of all three. Okay, been into loads of universities where they all talk about the student, and the students in my university, we reckon it's around 80% of our students are currently using Gen AI across the board in all different ways. Okay? When we interviewed them, they said, we think that's an underestimate. They think it's close to 90 to almost 100%. Okay? So if you think your students aren't using it, okay. Next, what are they using it? What are they using it for? Well, what they could be using it for, if the university did engage, would be personal tutoring and learning assistance. It's probably one of the biggest ones. I've been involved in personalized education for 20 years, and there's no doubt that this technology makes developing personal tutors so much easier and much more affordable to develop. The biggest problem with personalized learning was not that we couldn't do it, we could. Not that it didn't work, we knew it did. It was the actual development of the individual courses or the individual technologies and platforms were extremely high and very specific purpose. But this technology is far easier. And you're going to see a whole slew of personal tutors coming out over the next year and a half. The most obvious one, if anyone's ever tried it, is the Khan Academies. Khan Academy is this service provider for all school levels, math in the US and also Europe. They've now developed a personal tutor that seems to be quite good. Not available in Europe. Not sure why. There is a thing called GDPR, so I'm not sure if that's the problem. Why? But it's certainly been offered in the US when I last checked. Again, built on top of Gen AI. Proactive student support and engagement. You can build nudge systems, you can build these constantly check-in systems and so forth that we know work much easier, because they make intelligent suggestions and they make, if trained right and if curated correctly. And it's very useful for language learning, because remember, you talk to this thing, so you can practice, it can have a conversation with you. For the tutors and for lecturers, professors, it's really good for generating content. Now, you're the expert, so what happens is you can get to generate the content you want and then make sure it's correct and fix it in the end. So you can do the top 20% and get it to do the heavy lifting. And a lot of lecturers are doing that, by the way. It's really good for generating learning examples and context, images. The number of times I've heard people, I got this image generated from me, because you know what you want, but you really don't want to draw it. You haven't got that time, or to actually go to a graphic artist to get it done for you. Really handy for quick quizzes, really handy for lesson plans, distillation of answers. I know a number of school teachers who are using it to generate personalized lesson plans for their kids, because they know what their requirements are and they can shape it. It's not reckless. They're standing between the generation of that plan and what actually goes out to the student, because that's their expertise. But the heavy lifting of generating that becomes much easier. And auto-generating feedback. From administration and management, we see it in question answering, we see it in school surveys, admin supports, questionnaires, feedback, all sorts of ways. Now, there's a number of risks, and we talk about them in the third part of the talk, but that's the kind of the application we're seeing again and again and again. So what's the sentiment like? What are the universities saying about this? Well, there was a good paper in 2024 by Donald McDonald et al., which looked at sentiment around institutional statements. So maybe you're aware, and most of you, probably your university have already done this, but the first step into this area by universities is usually to give a statement on Gen AI. What does the university believe AI is? What are the values that it wants to protect within the university? And then maybe some FAQs, how it should be used. It's probably more a statement of direction by that university rather than a actual firm policy, because policies would involve firm rules and so forth, so it's the first step in. So this paper analysed the Gen AI statements and looked for the Gen AI statements from about 110, I'm guessing, somewhere like that, top universities in the US. What they found was about 63% of them had not only had Gen AI, positive Gen AI statements about how it should be used and so forth, and were considered to be encouraging. There was a much smaller number that were discouraging. We know that one US university actually decided to ban it until someone explained to them that they couldn't. They said, well, we're banning it on our machines, and someone said, well, actually, they have mobile phones. So I don't think banning works. And now I think most people realize that banning doesn't work. But they might have negative in terms of whether it should be used or when it should be used. And again, I'm not knocking that because we will see that there is a mix. So, the kind of examples of institutional advice, let's take some examples here. I've taken them from that paper just to illustrate. University of Chicago, for example, gets students to create text to fact check them and looking at practicing disciplinary research skills. So they're getting them to actually use it and then fact check to see, okay, you see, it doesn't always produce correctly. What are the kind of mistakes it makes, and so forth. Others are ads suggesting Gen AI to generate statements are analysed as inaccurate, misleading, incomplete, and unethical. So again, what we're saying, they're treating the students as adults and saying, you're going to use it and we're going to get you to have a big discussion about its use, and so you can recognise its strengths but also its weaknesses. Common suggestions were things for brainstorming with AI, so you can brainstorm ideas and go through those. AI can provide background information or generate lists of research questions that you can try out. You can use it to try and evaluate your own answer, so that it comes back and says, well, have you thought about this? Have you know what's missing or whatever? And also UCL is instructing teachers to use prompt logic used by students to generate information and then provide different prompts to help guide revision. Okay? So it's trying to actually look at how the academic would use it and then inform how the students use it. So, and this is the one part that was partly generated by ChatGPT. In a paper by Michel Villard et al. In 2023, they looked at issues around integrating GPT in higher education. What are the opportunities or the challenges? What was the barriers and what was the priorities? Now, what they did was they asked ChatGPT. Some of these are right, some of these are okay, reasonable. And to go through them, some of them are true, available 24/7. We forget sometimes how important that is for our students. Okay? I know I developed, in my earlier parts, virtual patients for training medical students to interview, how they interview medical patients. It was being used from 10 o'clock at night to 4 o'clock in the morning, because that was the time when the medical students were available and they wanted to use it in their own time. So we forget that, but that's really important. They also find that using these sort of tools, they're not judgmental, so the teacher doesn't feel that they're making a mistake. So actually it's less risk for them if they don't feel judged. So there's a whole series of opportunities there. But on top about the challenges though, the challenge is academic integrity. That's the first and foremost, because of the fact that when the student submits a piece of work to you, you don't know if it's being used, if they've used Gen AI for it. And that's the problem, okay? Quality control. How do you personalize? If you personalize, then you really do have to know more about that student, and how do you manage that information? That becomes a responsibility of the GPR. Expertise and authority. do we know what those foundational models were actually trained on? No. So what we want to do is we want to fine-tune them to be able to ensure that they are more biased to the correct content that we want, and that's what universities are doing at the moment. But there are other issues like to do privacy, bias, ethical and sustainability issues, and IP that are real challenges in this space. I'll talk about them later as well. Other ones that you would be more familiar with, or if anyone's in senior in management, was resistance to change by academics. Has been known to happen. Okay. The point is, you've got to make it clear that actually this really does make their job easier. Okay. Or it's an existential threat, which some journalists will try and claim. I'm not sure if it really is, but it certainly will change some of the lower hanging fruit of the higher education market. Ethical and privacy concerns, obviously, resource constraints. This thing is not cheap, okay? OpenAI are charging, I'm guessing, okay, I have to give all sorts of things, I'm not, but I think it's around about €20 per person, per student, per month. And you can work out what that would be. It is expensive to go down. Any organization I know that's gone down the enterprise route, it's a fair chunk of change. At least in the enterprise, they can see a profitability. It's not clear how that affects the bottom line of a state-funded university. So there is problems. There's legal and regulatory, because guess what? Yeah, education is one of the high risks. Quite rightly. So, what are the unintended consequences? So when you do deploy Gen AI, what happens? Well, a couple of things. First is, you'll see a movement to more in-person examinations almost straight away. As the students adopt, academics go, right, I need to be sure that they actually know, so I'm going to go back to my in face-to-face exams or invigilated exams or proctored exams. Second is a rebalancing of marks between continuous assessment to those exams. So I may already have a combination of both, but I'll move the marks weight back to the examination that I know that the student is there in. Still give credit for the continuous assessment, but not as much. In some respects, this is really disappointing. Okay, two reasons. One, because actually we know that the continuous assessment produces when if the student hasn't used Gen AI completely to generate the response and just cut and paste it. We know that they actually learn a lot of skills, and it actually makes it better for long-term memory. We also know that anyone with a disability, those continuous assessments are actually much better for them. They find in-face or in-person examinations much more difficult. So we do need to be careful here. We don't lose some of the benefits we've been putting in place for the last 5-10 years just because Gen AI might make a student do things they shouldn't. We reconsidered the type of assessment questions and activities. So this is now where we actually try to say, okay, let me change what question I'm asking. So I'm now going to talk about particular cases which are in my lecture notes that the student has to answer rather than just choosing the generalized. Or if you want, use things south of the border geographically, because that's not what Gen AI has been trained on. Gen AI has been trained on the colonial side of the world. So you can use different sorts of examples that won't be as easy. The realization that open books are much more than just an open book. Because in the old days, open book exams meant that they could just check their notes. Well, they're not just checking the notes. They could be having Gen AI to help them and prompt them and all everything else. So there's all sorts of interest. The other thing that is in there, it should be there, is the increase in proctoring. The investigation of use of proctoring. So what's happening is that if some students are taking an online exam from the home or whatever, can we put them in an environment where they can't be using other tools? Though we know that the Gen AI is not actually driving some of the responses, so they're actually using it right. Now, there's others who will say, well actually, when they go to work, they'll be using Gen AI, so why would you not just let them use Gen AI? Another paper, 2024, Gen AI can do harm in education. If you don't know the skill that you're trying to learn, and you're using Gen AI to get the answer, you'll never pick up that skill. Imagine if you gave your kids at the youngest age a calculator and never taught them to add or subtract. So if that calculator gave the wrong answer, they would never know. hey, we know Gen AI gives the wrong answer. It's called hallucination. Okay? So we do have to be careful where we use it and when we use it, in particular in terms of stepping and so forth. So again, it comes down to the academics and the academics' awareness of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And it's a really good paper if anyone wants to read it, I'll reference it there. So, if it's so inaccurate, or it's got problems in accuracy, what are people doing? Well, the very first one is prompt engineering, okay? Which is basically changing your prompt to either ensure that it's more accurate or to ensure you can fact check it more easily. So to ask it for references. Get it to expand on certain points if you're not sure that that's correct or wrong or whatever. So you can actually use prompt engineering. And remember, it's a conversation interface, so you don't have to do it all in the miracle of the one question to get it right. Second one is what we call retrieval augmented generation. This is where we give information, context information, with the query. So I'm looking at a problem about, let's say, the AI Act, and I give it the relevant sections that I'm talking about. Gen AI will use those as part of your query and try and ground your responses more accurately in that. So it's a way of actually ensuring your responses are more accurate. RAG has been used the majority of the time that enterprises are using Gen AI in an enterprise approach, they'll be using RAG. So, next one is fine tuning. So not only can you do this with your queries, but you can also take that big model and fine tune it on your own content, so that it will favor that content in its answering. Again, that allows you to be much more grounded in your topic, it allows you to be much more accurate in your responses. But there's obviously an increased cost. And that only, you're only ever allowed to do that if you buy an enterprise license. One of the other things that's going on in the AI community is what we call distillation. What we mean is having fine-tuned, it's still big and it's still going to take up a bit of a rainforest to run your queries. What we want to do is take that massive model and condense it into a much smaller model, because that large model has a lot of redundancy in it. That large model has a lot of stuff that you don't need. So you can actually condense it and put it into a much smaller model and then run that model for your specific purpose. That makes a much more efficient model. That's how, for example, certain vendors are putting Gen AI into the camera in your phone and into Internet of Things. Because it's not running a big model, and it's certainly not wanting to send personal data or whatever around the cloud. What it's doing is it's basically collapsing the model and putting it for specific purposes. Now, it's never as accurate, but again, it's one of the ones that are useful. It depends on what you're trying to do. So, agents. Simon introduced this notion. So, just want to be accurate in this one. We're just rebadging agents. It's just Gen AI. We've always had agents at Gen AI. There is also a move economically that we like to automate things, but I think in education, automation in education has never really worked so well. So we're still interested in the human-centric form of AI. It's still the form of AI that is important here. So we have a user making a query to an agent, typically the one you've probably come across is your conversational agent. ChatGPT is that little program, and it kind of looks like a text messaging between you and ChatGPT. And what it's doing, that's just your little application. It's on your mobile phone or on your PC, and it's talking directly to the large language model where the actual work, the heavy lifting is really being done. Prompt engineering is where you provide user information via another channel, and the agent has access to that. Okay? And that agent then includes that into a much more complex series of queries to the large language model that you never knew about, and is sending you back what appears to be much more accurate responses. Okay. Looks complicated? So one of the things I do, very lucky, I get to be a judge on the technology panel of our Young Scientist of the Year competition. These are all school kids, aged 17 to 12, competing in projects. 2 years ago, I had one student who had done this for a library. It was basically recommending books. And it had a conversation with you to find out what you liked and so forth, and then use that. And so when you have a conversation with it, and it was using all your past conversations to provide much more accurate queries get responses back, and that was in a day when ChatGPT wasn't around, and rather it wasn't available in this way, and come back with responses. So it was really powerful in terms of what it could do, and that was a 15-year-old. Okay. So what it does is it performs semantic search on the knowledge that you give it. It then uses snippets of that into your query and allows the large language model to produce much more accurate responses. How does that go forward? Well, if you're an enterprise or if you're a university, you can take your policies or you can take your educational material or whatever, and you can encode that. Encoding is just running through a program. It's not a big deal, but it converts all the text into ones and noughts and vectors that we can then feed into the large language model. And then it passes that back into the query, and then passes it in. And that's how a lot of the enterprises are currently, those that are using GenAI in a serious way, are beginning to use it. This approach came out toward the end of 22, early 23, and is becoming more adopted as a practice. And there's me building an SQL tutor. I used to teach SQL to all my computer science and computer engineering students, and I always taught them how to design. I just didn't want to teach them the language, so I just gave them a series of tutorials they could do online. But now we developed a tutor. They can ask any question they like about SQL, and the tutor will answer the questions about SQL and so forth, so that they get 24/7 support. That's the kind of example you can do, and that was used. We dealt it with 3.5, and we built it with 4. Fine-tuning in academic domains. So again, we can take the model and we can fine-tune an actual large model with the educational content. What that basically means is you take your large foundational model. Typically, you can use, if you have an enterprise version of GPT, or if you have an enterprise version of one of the others, you can fine-tune. They would fine-tune on their cloud, but you pay for it. Okay? The alternative is to take an open LLM, publicly available, put it in your own cloud and fine-tune. Fine-tune is again just one of your number of algorithms with your particular encoded content. And that produces a fine-tuned model for the areas that you want. So, just, okay, time? Yeah. Okay. So, you can use all of them at the same time as well. Okay, and we've done that. Risks and challenges. So, hallucinations, we all know GenAI gets the wrong answers. Lack of specificity, if you use them, it generalizes a lot. And expensive to train. People are using prompt engineering, RAG, and fine-tuning to address those. For expensive, customized models and so forth, and deductive reasoning, you're into fine-tuning really, and or model distillation. The risks, longer term, inclusivity, because of the data that these large language models have been trained on. Robustness, because of the unpredictability, particularly when there's retraining between the last time you use it and the next time. Interpretability and transparency, because you don't know where the data came from and you're not quite sure how it came up with its answer. Risk of evaluation and oversight. Again, as you train, even though you might have a good quality process, it'll still come out with errors and unexpected. And intellectual property infringement, because that's going to be the big one when the full AI Act hits. How can certain vendors be able to prove that they're actually compliant with the IP that's specified in the AI Act? For now, also any GDPR. So if an academic uploads a student piece of work into something like ChatGPT 3.5, you've just broken the law, because student work is considered personal data. So you can only do that if it's owned by the university, or you've an enterprise. So these kind of subtle gotchas you've got to understand. Simon introduced this, so I don't have to do it, but the point that you really need to know is education is covered in this, and it's a high risk, which means that if you're going to use it for assessment, only for assessment, if you're going to use it to automatically assess your students, you need to be certified. And certifications will be available about it's 2 years hence. And not going to go through the other levels, they're not that important. So, strategies for adoption. First of all, the skills needed. We do need to look at our AI literacy, and actually that's going to be part of the AI Act as well, so you have to do it if you're going to be using it. You need to know the regulatory, what's allowed and what's not allowed. Second thing is you do need to have the ability to compose prompts, which is relatively straightforward, but there are so many different forms of prompt and the results they produce, so you do need to know those. Depending on your responsibility, you do need to have an idea of what the strategic roadmap of Gen AI is. And you do need to understand the adoption models. The current adoption model at the moment in universities, the students are adopting it themselves. The university president gets worried, comes down to the IT director. The IT director says, no, we could never afford that. And then all of a sudden, the debate starts. That's typically the initiation of it. But we do need to have that adoption model. And the technical skills then within the university, you have to understand the data management, curation, how you fine-tune, and what the LLM pipeline is. So what is part of this adoption policy? Well, the first one is the awareness, things like this, and spreading them out within your university. You need to have a comprehensive institutional policy, and you need to have the adoption suiting that. So that means the top have to be connected. Okay. Second thing is faculty training. They need to have the necessary tools, and they need to be well positioned to lead their students. Third thing is that teaching and assessment practices need to be developed. So whoever is responsible for teaching and learning and training within your organization needs to be laying that out for the academics. It's not fair for them to come up with that. And they can choose whatever they want based on their disciplines, and it will be different. So we have different, in our university, there are different acceptances of Gen AI at different modules depending on what they're teaching and depending on what level they're teaching at and what assessments they can be used for. And it may make it a little bit difficult for the student to know exactly what, but they have a handbook, it tells them for that course. But that's the level it's got to go down to. The students need to be part of this. So when we're doing this, we bring in the students and we let them know in the students' union, if the students' union and so forth, because that's the only way to make this happen. And then you do need to be carrying out applied research in it in your university and connecting it back. Because this whole area is moving so fast that it's not okay, but we'll take our snapshot now and we roll out and in 2 years we'll be there. And you find that in 2 years Gen AI has moved on to something else. And it's too late. And I'm going to leave one more slide. So I've talked a little bit about the back office, where you use it for particular classes, particular works and so forth. If it's being used to change the actual service that the university is doing, we call it a game changer. Where we've seen one or two institutions which are now just turning over to Gen AI to run the courses that they're running. They're actually changing the whole offering of the university. Typically these are online universities and they're specific courses. But we are seeing that, and that's beginning to emerge as an option within our just for an opportunity. So conclusions, they're really powerful, they provide very natural interface, they are shaping the domains and behaviors, and they are multidisciplinary. However, they do come at risks, hallucination bias, ethical, legal. We do need to have proper adoption policies within our universities and proper supports along the way. But this is different to a lot of other technologies that have come out. We're seeing the adoption at such a high level, and we're seeing that the way it's affecting is different. But if we put it in a way where it actually enhances the academic and student, then we have a way to actually really enhance our universities, rather than trying to see it as an automation technique. And with that, I finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wade. I recognize University of Montpellier in many processes of panic you described, actually. And do we have time maybe for one question? So don't be shy. Ludovic, as usual.
Actually, there is something that really struck me, which is that when you describe that actually we don't really yet understand the internal process within the AI tool or whatever, how it reaches a decision. So taking this actually, how can we then explain that we are so rapidly adopting such technology when there is still a risk of not understanding how the decision is taken?
Okay, can I continue? Okay, when I do this talk in the university, I usually spend about 10 minutes explaining how Gen AI actually works, but we didn't do that because of time. Okay, so Gen AI is completely based on probability. It's a probability distribution of what the next word will be, okay? What's amazing about it is that it actually produces intelligent responses, responses that actually are both eloquent and frequently correct, okay? There is lots of research to look at those neural networks to work out exactly how it comes up with its response. We think we understand bits and pieces of it, but they're at quite a high level. If I can explain it, it's like watching a football match on your TV, and then you open up the back of the TV to see where the wires go and try and work out how the football is rendered as it moves across the TV. That's pretty much what it's like, okay? Because all you're doing is looking at weightings and activation functions, okay? So the answer is no, we actually don't. What we do know is we have a predictability. If you put in this input, we'll produce that output. So it's very much that way. The reason why people have been adopting it is because they put other things on the far side to make sure that the answer that's produced is for somebody who actually understands this and can correct if necessary and so forth. So for example, for a domain expert like an academic, if I get it to try and explain, let's imagine I'm doing something on GDPR, right? I get it to give me the quick explanation of a particular piece of it. And it might give me something and I go, okay, well that's right, but that's actually a bit wrong and I can be more specific here or whatever. And then use it. So I'm using it that way, right? Students don't necessarily use it exactly the same way because if they may not be as expert. But what we always try and do is try and build with them as we show them how to do it, what sort of queries to do to mitigate the chances of it being wrong, and also what to do when you get an answer to see whether or not it's actually correct or not. How do you fact check and all about that kind of thing. Once you have those behaviors in place, then actually it actually does provide a lot of use for. Okay? So majority of times, that's why, for example, it's not allowed to be used in the high risk areas. Mission critical, all those kind of ones, not allowed. Okay? Has to be a human looking at that before it makes a decision. And that's why on the next level down, it's got to be certified because it's got to do certain tests and so forth. So in some respects, that's the reason why we're able to do it. So it is able to be used in healthcare. It is able to be used in across multiple areas that you kind of go, oh wow, can it really be used there? Because that's the way that they've taken a risk-based approach to its certification. So does that kind of answer your question? So there's still a massive amount of research on how a neural network actually, but it's a phenomenon based on the volume of training and the configuration of the actual neural network itself. Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, my question is just, you mentioned the huge cost of models now, and also then kind of the costs of getting commercial products for students.
Yep.
And so historically you might say that you either build your own or you buy something off the market. So you buy something off the market, it's very both of those options are very expensive.
Yep.
And it's sort of what's the what do you see as the sort of ways forward in dealing with that in a sector that's not known for being one that's in publicly funded systems in particular,
Yep.
one where there's a lot of money flowing in for things?
Okay, yeah. So I count myself in that situation. It's tricky, okay, it is tricky. There are certain universities who have taken licenses out of commercial providers who have done it for particular sets of students or particular situations. Okay, so they're kind of needs specific, or they're specifically looking at particular issues. There are other universities, particularly in Norway, where they've actually taken their own model, put it into the cloud, and fine-tuned it, and have integrated with their own LMSs and so forth. So they're made available to the students and their academics directly. And the truth is somewhere in between. So one of the things that could be done is, like, we don't compete on books and we don't compete on descriptions of our course. So we could share open models that are in an area and then build front ends or whatever for our own LMSs or whatever, and it could. So this is sort of sharing knowledge, and that's the way we do it at academia level. We could do that to fine tune in our particular areas if we wanted. So there's certainly an interest in that side of things. I think the problem is that it's very difficult for a commercial vendor to tune something exactly for our universities, because we will always need some element of control of it. Okay, because of our courses or because of the differences and so forth. So whether a university goes alone, or whether a university goes as a consortium or as a collaboration, and that becomes a shared resource for that, and it can't be done on a per seat basis, because those numbers become very expensive very quickly. But I do think that's kind of the way we do it. I think also that it needs to be good enough. Is the answer? It doesn't have to be massively, because we can put in place the other services around it, to do with both training of the academic and whatever's needed at the moment. Like, you do need to fact check the results of this, blah blah blah, and disclaimers and so forth. I think that you might look at particular areas within universities where there's massive amounts of students, and think of those. So you can prioritize certain areas. So I think there's lots of ways in which we can, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? It's at that level. Does that make sense? And they're pretty much similar strategies that have been used in other areas. But whether or not a vendor is certainly going to make one really free, whatever. 3.5 is just not. It doesn't really cut it for universities, and isn't able to be tuned the way we want to have it tuned. So.
Thank you very much, Professor Wade. Then, and applause.
Thank you, Vanessa. Well, now, after a long and hopefully enjoyable afternoon,